I want to get back into that story we touched on last night in relation to volunteer firefighters. Big issue, huge issue in Victoria. The volunteer fire brigades will join with the Metropolitan Fire Brigade shortly in the coming days to form a new service. It's called Fire Rescue Victoria. Now, the Andrews government insists this is a win for anyone involved in firefighting, but it's left thousands, 54,000 volunteers out, left them in the lurch, really. They're angry and they don't know what's happening. There's been a lack of consultation. Vice President of the Volunteer Fire Brigades of Victoria, Samantha Rothman, joined me last night on the show.
To be honest, I don't know why the government are not honouring their commitments. Some of the commitments that they made were to consult with the volunteers during this process, and I have to say that has not happened at all.
I said last night I'd follow up with the opposition and see if they're prepared to stand up for the firefighters, the volunteer firefighters. So here is the opposition, Mr Nick Wakeling. He's a Victorian Shadow Minister for Emergency Services, and he joins me now from Melbourne. Nick, I don't think there's any other Victorian more loved and honoured than the volunteer firefighters. Victoria's had some pretty horrific, historically and in recent times, fire seasons. Why are they being treated like this, and where does the Liberal Party stand?
Oh, thanks, Peter. And you're right. Volunteers have a long history of protecting this state and protecting this nation. I mean, let's not forget that in January, we had literally thousands of Victorians fighting fires in Victoria and in New South Wales. Premier Andrews, his government, was out there on the fire ground with his arms around volunteers, getting selfies to congratulate them for the work that they were doing. But here we are with the rollout of this new FRV program, and instead of supporting volunteers, he's attacking them. They feel let down. They feel that this government has lied to them. You heard that interview last night, which clearly articulates what I'm hearing and my colleagues are hearing across this state. Our hard-working volunteers, 54,000 of them, feel let down, feel neglected, feel lied to by this government.
OK, there's a bit of history here, and I've got to keep it truncated because I want to ask you about this defence issue in Victoria too. But why you had the volunteer CFA, Country Fire Authority in Victoria, volunteers and people that were attached to the CFA as full-timers, careerists. And then you had the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, which is unionised. The careerists over here with the volunteers have to join the Metropolitan Fire Brigade to form this new service. So we leave all of these 54,000 volunteers out in the cold. They say there's no consultation and a lack of clarity. Why are we even doing this in the first place? What's the problem we're trying to fix? Isn't this just some sort of union play by Daniel Andrews? And what's the benefit for Victorians? What happens next?
Well, I, like you, have been represented and supported by CFA volunteers in my community. And there has been no explanation given by this government as to why these changes were needed. The government said to the Victorian community that these changes would improve emergency services for the state. Well, that's simply not true. Our volunteers have been worse off. Career staff in the CFA will leave the CFA. We will see less permanent staff supporting CFA volunteers. Volunteers have been effectively cast aside. Government's making decisions at the behest of the unions and others, and no one's talking to volunteers, but more importantly, nobody's asked the volunteers if this is needed. I was out today in Gippsland.
Nick, sorry to just jump in there, but we saw over the summer the chaos of all these changes, what it's already done to the system that was one of the best in the country. The ADF had to be brought in the fire season in Victoria over Christmas, basically to save lives. You've now got a Premier in the middle of this COVID crisis being offered the same ADF resources to fix the mess that's now become a second wave in Victoria. Yes, he was taking the resources earlier today. Now he's not. What on earth is going on here in Victoria?
Well, what a disaster. I mean, Tuesday the Premier didn't need any ADF personnel. Then Wednesday he's asked for 1,000. And now he's turned around a day later and said he doesn't need 850. I mean, this is an internal war, I understand, between the Police Minister and the Health Minister. We're in the middle of this pandemic. There's been calls out for ADF to come in and provide support for Victorians, and the government doesn't even know what it wants. I mean, what does
All right,
that
let me
tell
just pick that
Victorians?
up. Let me just pick up that point so people at home can follow what you just said. So you've got the Health Minister, Jenny Markakis. If the ADF came in, I suppose she'd have some role in working with Linda Reynolds, the federal Defence Minister, and what that ADF personnel do. And then you've got two women, if the Police stay running things down here in terms of COVID, she's in control. So you've got Nikki Wakeling, I've got to leave it there, but he can act the federal Defence Minister, and what that ADF personnel do. And then you've got Lisa Neville, the Police Minister. If the police stay running things down here in terms of COVID, she's in control. So you've got two women, in ministerial terms, bluing over their turf. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, you know, Victorians, Australians saw what happened with the Adam Somyurek disaster, and it appears that you've got two ministers more interested in an internal fight instead of focusing on what's needed for the state to deal with COVID. I mean, the Defence Force would be sitting back shaking their heads at this government. I mean, you asked for 1,000, we said we'd help you, and then you turn around and tell us you're not needed anymore. I mean,
so do you
clearly
think
this government's not in charge.
You're across this brief. Do you think Victoria must take at least 800 to 1,000 of the defence personnel that they said this morning they needed?
Well, yesterday the government said it needed that number. I mean, I think what is needed is that the government needs to work with the federal government and ensure that we have these personnel deployed in the state. I mean, it was clearly a need yesterday. What's happened today? I mean, and what's going to happen on Friday? I mean, the government's clearly not in charge. Somebody needs to take control. We've got growing cases of coronavirus across the state, and the government seems to be more focused on an internal battle between two ministers than focusing on our health problems.
Yeah, I've got to say, Nick Wakeling, I've got to leave it there, but he can act almost overnight, within 12 hours, when it comes to Labor Party branch stacking, sack the lot of them, bring in administrators. And now it's a week into Victoria's resurgent COVID crisis, and he's yes to the ADF, he's no to the ADF, it's all over the shop. It is a mess, and it's a vacuum of leadership. Nick Wakeling, thanks for your time.
Thank you.